Today is as amazing as I had hoped. It's as inspiring as I had promised. And now we enter our next session, Leading for Equity, Responding, Recovering, Reinventing, and Racial Justice Roundtable. Our next session will explore what our education system would look like if all students, especially our most vulnerable, were supported to thrive. This roundtable conversation will explore issues at the intersection of the pandemic, recession, and racial justice, and generate ideas for how teachers can drive impact through policy, practice, and advocacy. I'm excited about this one. And I'd like to now welcome our session moderator, John King Jr., who you know has an extensive resume of work in the education field that spans over decades. He's been a state education commissioner, the National Secretary of Education. Now he's the president and CEO of Education Trust. He will further introduce himself and the panelists, a few big brothers and sisters of mine, mentors, if you will. So I'm excited to hear what they have to share. But welcome in, John. How are you today?
Doing well. Good to see you, Casey. Thank you for hosting today and for facilitating a great conversation.
Well, this is amazing. I don't want to take up not another second of the time because you have a power panel assembled to share with us. Thank you for what you do and what you have done and what you continue to do. We all appreciate you very much, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much. Well, I'm excited about this panel, and in many ways this panel extends on the opening remarks from Linda and certainly from Reverend Dr. Barber. Dr. Barber set us in a good direction by framing this conversation in the context, really, of these two public health crises that we're grappling with as a country. The public health crisis of COVID-19, which has disproportionately impacted communities of color and low-income communities, and simultaneously a long overdue national reckoning with racism and systemic racism, which is very much its own public health crisis that has been with us since the beginning of the nation. It's really a long overdue reckoning with 400 plus years of anti-Blackness. And so that's the spirit in which I hope we'll engage in this conversation, helping to think about what is the role of schools in advancing equity and justice in this moment. As you said, Casey, we have a phenomenal panel of superstar leaders and educators. We have Mary Cathryn Ricker, who is the Commissioner of Education for the state of Minnesota, who was a National Board Certified middle school English teacher, was the Executive Vice President of the AFT, and is doing the tremendously challenging work of trying to help the state of Minnesota work through this very difficult moment in Minnesota. I've been thinking a lot about Minnesota this week, and in recent weeks, given not only the death of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, but also recalling visiting as secretary St. Paul, Minnesota, the school where Philando Castile worked, who was killed in Minnesota by a police officer four years ago, yesterday. We also have with us Jemelleh Coes, who was the 2014 Georgia Teacher of the Year, also taught middle school or middle grades language arts and math, is now getting a PhD and doing the vitally important work of training a next generation of teachers. And we have Josh Parker, a fellow Marylander who was the 2012 Maryland Teacher of the Year, also taught middle school English. So we could have a powerhouse middle school English online learning course right here with the assembly of teachers that we have here. And Josh now works in Baltimore County, helping to support other teachers in their work to close opportunity gaps in Baltimore County. So thrilled to have this group together and want to dive right into the conversation, maybe framing a first question around education equity in this COVID-19 moment. There was a recent study that focused on learning loss, or what we like to call at the Education Trust unfinished learning. And the study suggested that on average, students will have lost 7 months of learning, but that will be worse for students of color, that would be 9 months for Latino students, 10 months for African American students. That is a lot to make up for as we head back to school in continued challenging circumstances. I'd love maybe for each of you to talk about how COVID-19 has impacted equity from your perspective and what we ought to be doing as a country to address the learning challenges that students are going to be returning to school with in September. So maybe we'll start with you, Mary Cathryn.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. And hello to everyone who's joining us. I am really, really grateful to be part of this panel. And I'll just briefly talk about our approach in the state of Minnesota. When we first launched distance learning on March 15th, and we started planning for it, that unfinished learning, and I'm going to borrow that Ed Trust phrase, John, because I think that's right. We started noticing that in the first phase of distance learning. We started hearing anecdotally from educators, we started hearing from families, we started hearing from students themselves. And so this is one of those quintessential teacher moments where you need to monitor and adjust, right? As reflective practitioners, we need to figure out how to do things better. And it's the same as your classroom as it is at the Department of Education in Minnesota. And so between that first phase of distance learning and that second phase, we started gathering what was working in our schools to meet the needs of our most vulnerable students, or to meet the needs who needed the greatest number of accommodations, whether they had an IEP plan or a 504 plan, or whether they were experiencing housing instability, learning English as a new language. And we created, we sort of stopped what we did in between phase 1 and phase 2, created 2 professional development days, added some professional development through the rest of the end of the days in April, so that we could gather some of that information and share it out to the educators or the school communities where they had really been struggling. And we went into that next phase of distance learning then at the end of April, beginning of May, first having shared out some promising practices, but then also saying, be on the lookout for those practices that are working. Ramp up those opportunities to talk with your colleagues, to figure out what is working, what is not. And by all means, any of those practices that you had borrowed from your brick and mortar setting that weren't working, abandon them. This is your opportunity to recreate a learning environment that is radically student-centered, thinking of the space a student is in, thinking of the responsibilities they may have now that they are at home, thinking of the opportunities they have because they are immersed in their families and their communities, and be radically student-centered as you build that distance learning plan. And those were some of the approaches we went into distance learning with. And then, of course, at the end of May, with the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, it actually put such a spotlight on what we had already anecdotally been collecting during distance learning, that we realized we needed that additional support to make sure that we were even more radically student-centered and equity-driven than the evidence that we were already collecting had shown us.
Thanks, Mary Cathryn. Let me ask Jemelleh for you to add to that.
Absolutely. So I think, like Mary Cat was saying, we have an opportunity to reimagine education in these moments. And I think that one way that we do that very intentionally is to think about how we look at our curriculum and teach it differently, or teach it more intentionally. So right now, students are they are absorbing a lot of the world around them. They are hyper aware of what is going on. They are asking questions. They may have people to talk to. They may not have people to talk to. So as educators, when we return to our classroom spaces, we need to make sure that we are teaching our content in meaningful ways. So for example, if we go back to the classroom and we are still teaching, let's say, slope-intercept form, I'm just picking something, right? If we're teaching slope-intercept form and we're still just talking about roller coasters, we are missing the mark. So we can teach things like slope-intercept form in conjunction with the social issues that are happening around our students. So we can teach about what trends look like as far as both epidemics, the racial epidemic as well as the health epidemic, and teach students to look at charts and graphs and slope-intercept form from those lenses. So being intentional about creating a curriculum that our students can connect with in this moment because they're listening. The other thing that I think that we need to think about just as educators in what will be long-term loss or what will be our learning loss is thinking about the long-term implications of that loss. Because right now we're in this moment, but this will have long-term ramifications. How are we helping our students to heal themselves and whatever traumas they have gone through while they have been away from us and unconnected from us? And really attending to their social and emotional needs, really attending to teaching them to be mindful, teaching them to take care of themselves so that they can learn and they can thrive when their learning really ramps up again. So I think we have to take care of lots of parts of our students as we think about what they have lost in this time.
Thanks so much. Josh?
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. I follow John on Twitter and now Mary Cathryn and certainly my colleague, Dr. Coes. And I'm just happy to be on this call with you all. And thank you for all of your work, Secretary King, throughout your career. I'm going to come hopefully from a practitioner, professional development perspective, as my career spans all those things. When I was in Baltimore County, where I won Teacher of the Year, I did things at the system level. I was a classroom teacher in middle school, high school, English. And when I went to DC, I was a coach. And now as I work for Unbound Ed as a professional development sort of leader, there's all these factors to it. But I want to center in on what makes the difference. And that always is, like Mary Cathryn said and Dr. Coes said, it's always about the teaching, but the art and science of teaching itself. So when we think about what students are losing and the gaps that are there, we want to also think about what have students learned during this time. And so when we think about Gloria Ladson-Billings, who talks about culturally responsive instruction as what can we use from students that we can build on, I think as we return to school, however it looks like, we need to think about how can we invite what they've learned over this time. Dr. Coes talked about this idea of if we're talking about roller coasters, but not about the roller coaster of emotions that we've been through during the racial unrest and the pandemic, then we're not using what students have experienced to bridge to learning. And most learning is about bridging and connecting from what someone has experienced to something that's new. So I want to add on to Ed Trust and Unbound Ed uses the same language, unfinished learning. We also use this phrase that combines unfinished learning with unfinished teaching, which is unfinished instruction. This idea that it is not just about what kids haven't learned, but students and teachers haven't had the opportunity to actually teach. And so there's unfinished teaching, there's unfinished learning, there's unfinished instruction. The challenge, and I think what I want to push everyone who's listening to really think about and watching, is to not let unfinished instruction lead to further unfinished teaching. So when we come back in September, in August, we can't take the whole year to try to think about all that we didn't cover. We have to progress and then use just-in-time scaffolds and just-in-time supports so that we can continue the trajectory of learning. I started to think, when I was my first few years in education, I always thought that we have to review in full before going on to something new. Well, as I continued to learn, I said, well, not everyone is going to have all the prerequisites in order to get to the new content. So I have to teach the grade level content in ways that builds on their culture. And when they present as missing something, fill in with appropriate scaffolds. Because that's the way to honor that kids can grab things and go. They can learn and continue to learn at accelerated rates. I fear that if we focus on trying to catch up all that we've missed, we'll continue to be in a perpetual catching up mode. And so I'd like to just conclude with saying that the key to all of this is collaboration in learning. Let's learn from the parents about their experience during the pandemic and racial unrest. Let's learn from the students as to what they've learned and what they'd like to learn. And let's think creatively about how we teach grade level standards in ways that don't disrespect their potential to pick it up as we go along. And so I think that's really, really important in this. There are going to be a lot of losses, but there are a lot of things that have been gained during this time for kids. We want to make sure that we also build on that.
I love that. I love that notion of trying to focus on acceleration rather than just remediation, and thinking about how do we make instruction really good in whatever form it takes. And so I want to pick up on that theme and ask you each to comment about how do we do hybrid learning, distance learning well. And let's take as a given, hopefully, that Congress acts responsibly, sets aside the level of funding necessary so that school can open in the fall in a safe way, that Congress prevents huge cuts from school districts and takes significant financial resources from the federal level, and that Congress does what is necessary to make sure we close the digital divide, because we know there were kids who weren't able even to get access to school this spring because they didn't have the adequate devices or internet. Let's assume that Congress in the next month puts aside the resources necessary to do that. We certainly are going to fight for that at Ed Trust. Assuming the resources are in place, though, we still are looking at the likelihood many districts will still be using hybrid or distance learning potentially for much of next school year. It may vary which grades, and it may vary how different it looks in September than December, but there's little question that online teaching will still be a part of our lives this coming school year. What would you say it should look like? What are some things you've seen over the last few months that make you hopeful? What should folks be thinking about as they try to support their colleagues to make online learning work well for kids this coming year? And let me start this time with you, Jemelleh.
So this is a great question, and I think about it a lot from various perspectives. As a parent, as an educator, as an educator of educators, as a community person. And I just want to first say that I think it's important that we recognize that districts are basically choosing the best tasting fish oil in this, right? Like none of it's good. So we are like, everyone is doing their very best to come up with the very best solutions. And I think that as people develop their plans, I think that we just need to remember that everyone is truly doing their best. So I come as a parent with a PhD in educational theory and practice. I have taught at all various grade levels. I have taught teachers how to teach at various grade levels. And I will tell you, in those last few months of trying to get my child on to digital learning, I almost lost my stuff. All of it, like all of it. It was the most difficult thing I had ever done. And there were some days that I was like, girl, just go watch Netflix. That's what it came to. So I think what's really important, and what was helpful to me finally, was when educators made something very easy. It was very streamlined. So when I could put her on the computer and all she had to do was click and go, I could let her do that. Like that felt good. That felt like she was learning. That felt like she was engaged. It needed to be very simple even for someone with an educational background and educational experience. Her teachers, they were absolutely outstanding in being able to be reached, but sometimes I would be struggling at home and they would have no idea that I was struggling. And for me to have to reach out to them was just it was an extra step that I didn't have time to do because I was working from home as well. I think that the advice and what I would encourage educators to continue to think about is thinking about what compassion looks like in this time. Compassion over what has traditionally been compliance. And what I mean by that is sometimes students won't be able to get every single assignment that you have outlined completed. Like it's just not a reality for some of them. And I will tell you, some days my daughter became a babysitter for my little one because I had to get work done. and I needed that grace from teachers, right? So I needed the flexibility to be able to do what I needed to do at home, to take care of home, and also to be able to take care of her learning. So I think giving options, but very direct and very easy to access options is going to be helpful in making sure that when we go, like, depending if it's all digital or hybrid, that it runs seamlessly and smoothly for most parents.
Thanks. Josh?
I was taking notes on what Dr. Coes was saying, but I think with hybrid learning, some people call it brick-to-click learning. I've heard that as a nice little turn of phrase. I think there are a couple of things that are really important. First, clarity. And this is really a takeoff of what Dr. Jemelleh was saying, which is how clear are the schools and the teachers what the expectation is of work for the kids, and also how they're going to help the kids, the students, when they actually get something wrong. I find that in a hybrid learning environment, what is missing that can be present in the traditional learning environment is the feedback loop. When a kid doesn't get it, what do I do? And or when a student is able to go to the next level, am I able to reach that person? So there needs to be clarity on the expectation. There needs to be this idea of here's what you can expect from me as a teacher in terms of how I can help accelerate and or fill in whatever gaps might be present. But the other side of that is here's how you as a parent can help me. So parents are a natural resource. They are a human resource. They are so necessary to this going well. And I'm glad that we're in a situation where we're talking about these communities and the parents and how rich they are to the discourse. And hopefully we don't forget that in a year or two when we're mostly traditional again. So engaging parents with clarity is a really key point because they're with their kids as often as we are, and they know them well too. So being clear about what parents can do to support us is really important. The other part that I want to talk about is relevance. So first is clarity. The second is relevance. Kids who have options, meaning that they are not state mandated right now because of the environment to be in a physical location, they want to connect to things that make sense to them. They want to come into a classroom that's talking about not only the real world, but things that are interesting to them or things that are made interesting to them that they can relate to. They want to have power within the conversation. It can't be just dittos and worksheets. It has to be conversations where they critique, where they invite, where they bring information to the discussion. So the relevance piece makes this hybrid learning connective for kids. It's really, really important. So we have clarity, we have relevance, but I don't want to knock out the last part, which is social. How are we engendering connection in the virtual space? How are we making learning not just about something, but about someone, about people, about a story? How are we ensuring that privacy, but also that intimacy on the virtual space, which might mean that system leaders and principals and teachers become savvy with how to use the different platforms, right? There's a technical part to it, but the adaptive piece is, how do I make learning that connects kids together virtually and in person? How do I make it so that what they are learning is relevant to their lives or they bring relevance to the subject? That's opening up the pedagogy. And also, how am I being clear with what I'm asking and how I'm engaging parents? So when we think about clarity, relevance, and the social aspect, I think those are the connective tissues that will help this hybridization happen well. And so those are some of the thoughts that I have while taking notes on Dr. Coes.
Thank you. Mary Cathryn, as a parent, when I hear Jemelleh and Josh talk, that sounds like what I want for my girls who will be in 9th and 12th grade in Montgomery County Schools next September. But I worry about whether or not teachers have enough support to execute on that vision. So I'd be curious, how are you thinking about the work that the state can do, that districts can do, that AFT national or local unions can do? How can we get teachers the support they need in order to make that more positive vision of distance and hybrid learning possible?
I really appreciate that question because it allows me to reject what has traditionally been a frame of teaching, and that is that it's a very isolating profession, right? That you are alone in your classroom with your students and that you're not really connected to your peers, or you don't really get a chance to interact with your principal or assistant principal that often, or any of the other talent, that you don't have deeply meaningful relationships with the families of your students, right? So that old frame of teaching, actually, this is the perfect time to throw it in the dustbin. And actually, Dr. Coes and Mr. Parker actually gave us some of those stepping stones already to get to what teachers would need. And so these are some of the promising practices we've started to see in some of the strongest distance learning environments, and even in some of the hybrid environments we're seeing in summer learning in Minnesota. And that is back to what I asked folks to do back in March, and that was think of a space the students are in, to be as radically student-centered as possible. Think of that space our students are in and use an asset-based lens in that. Again, one of the things I appreciate about unfinished learning or even unfinished teaching is that it's talking about progress. There's a forward momentum to that phrase that also rejects a lot of the phrases we've heard people use to describe the disparities that have truly grown during distance learning, right? Those sort of that deficit-based framing we've heard about students, what they've lost, what they've missed, what they didn't get, what they don't have, which completely, like, those disparities have grown. Absolutely, period, full stop. And our students are in rich learning environments. They are immersed in their families. They are immersed in their communities. They are learning. Dr. Coes talks about connecting our academic knowledge to what they are learning as well. What sort of leadership roles did they take on during distance learning that as a classroom teacher, I can actually use as a bridge to academic learning? Were they responsible for taking care of their younger siblings? What sort of ways did they innovate in this time? Did they take responsibility for moving from that brick and mortar setting where they were highly regulated, right? They were highly told, like, at 8:05 you go to school, and at 8:55 you go to second period, and at 9:45 you go to third period, right? And now they suddenly are responsible for shaping their school day, for shaping their entire day. So the first thing we need to do is be radically student-centered and figure out what are some amazing ways our students have grown, and how do we connect that academic knowledge to those amazing ways and give them credit for that, recognize that, and then recognize all the ways their families and communities have been contributing to that growth during this time. That is the most equitable way of thinking of that space our students are in. One of the other things I want to say, again, in speaking of, like, be a team member like you have never been a team member as a teacher before. And that is the most successful school systems I have seen really manage equitable distance learning or hybrid learning have thought of really creative roles for paraprofessionals and the talents they bring into a building. That a paraprofessional in a brick and mortar setting may have had one set of very important responsibilities. In a distance learning setting, where our schools have rethought of how to tap into the talent as well as the relationships paraprofessionals have with their students and with families and in the community, those are places where students and families both are more engaged. And there you have another really meaningful partnership that is right alongside you. And then one of the third areas I've seen are those educators alongside us who actually are already experts on limited or interrupted formal education. We do have educators who have spent a lot of time studying and practicing how to meet the needs of students whose formal education has been interrupted. And we can look at different distance learning settings and different communities and say that our students have had interrupted formal education experiences. What are our colleagues who regularly work with students who have had significantly interrupted formal education? What are they telling us to do? How could they lead some of the professional development around us? So those are some of the actions I am encouraging educators to take right next to them. And then at the same time, it is definitely our responsibility as the Department of Education for you as a parent to know that, one, we want to communicate directly with students and families like we have never done before. Very often, a traditional role of the Department of Education is to support the practitioners who then support students and families. We recognize that in this time of uncertainty, if a family can turn to an additional place for additional knowledge, another place to ask questions, another place to get support or information, we know we have a responsibility to play that role as well. And so whether that is making sure that we are stepping up to speak directly to families, to make sure that we are translating materials ourselves and not just counting on our local school communities to translate those materials for our families, that we are doing that when it's possible, and that we are talking directly to families, and more importantly, listening directly to families so that we have a really good idea of what these families, like Dr. Coes' point about like the grace I might need as a parent, or the successes that we need to know about so that we can do a better job supporting the practitioners in your life as well.
Thank you. That's a very hopeful vision. That gives me hope about what this coming school year can look like. But I want to turn us to this other public health crisis of systemic racism and pick up on a theme that Reverend Barber raised about statues versus statutes and symbolism versus substance. And we need to change the symbolism, but we also need to keep folks focused on the substance. Almost every school district, state agency put out a statement in the last month that said that they believe Black Lives Matter and that they intend to be anti-racist. But one of my worries, and it's not just for school districts and states, it's also for corporations and foundations, is that those statements will just be words and that they won't be followed by real substantive change. Because we've been here before. We've had these moments of national reckoning before, and they haven't turned into real change in the day-to-day experience of kids, families, and educators of color. So let me ask you each to describe, what would you say it will take to make those statements of solidarity into substantive change? And in this community, this incredible Enstoy community of teacher leaders, what should folks carry? What's the message folks should carry back to their school district leaders, their school boards, their state boards of education about how to make those pledges of solidarity substantive? How to make this moment different than moments in the past? And let me start with you, Josh.
So I'm going to put in a plug for the breakout session that's going to happen in about 20 or 30 minutes with me and Dr. Coes. We're going to talk about that in much more detail happening today. So I really appreciate the question, John. And what a statement from Dr. Barber earlier. From statues to statutes. Only a preacher can make something like that, right? I think that's something that I have been thinking about personally for this time. I've written many blogs about how I personally experience the murders of Black men, being a Black man myself, and also being an educator. So I think the best statement any system can make is in changed policies, practices, and procedures, right? So the statements are great, but if the people inside the organization see that statement as foreign, then there's actually internal work that has to happen in the organization itself. I saw a tweet where someone said, just saw the statement from my company about being anti-racist. That's news to me, right? And I think that too many teachers, and specifically Black and brown teachers and professionals, are having the same reaction. They're saying, well, we've been talking about this as teachers for a very long time, and now there's a statement, but where's the policy? Where's the practice? Where is the lived reality for me as a professional? Am I treated in a way that makes my life matter? Have you done that with me? Have you listened? And so some of the things that are actionable that can happen is listen to the people of color in your district. That's probably a good first step, because we have been saying things for a very long time. Also, there seems to be in every system decision makers that remain hidden. So that when disparity happens, we don't know who did it, who greenlighted it. I say reveal those decision makers. Be transparent as to who is making the decision about course availability, about what teachers teach where. It's really interesting that in certain districts, when you look at how segregated the schools are, well, the staff are segregated as well, such that Black and brown teachers teach in Black and brown schools instead of some of the predominantly white. That's a policy problem, right? When we talk about curriculum that doesn't reflect reality, well, what has happened in the policy and in the procedures that has allowed that curriculum to be what we teach? And so there has to be a discussion after the statement that talks about what is the lived experience of the professionals in your district, as well as the students in your district. There's got to be discussion. There has to be change at these specific levels. And I think that's really important. I want to tag into something that Mary Cathryn said that I thought was really powerful. She gave a lot of powerful solutions from a leadership perspective. And it had me thinking, John, I don't want just to lament the unfinished teaching and the unfinished learning. I don't want our districts to have unfinished leading, such that the people that are in charge have not developed their leading so they can actually move statements into policy and practice and procedure. There shouldn't be unfinished leading for equity in our systems, in our schools. And so I think the conversation is first, and then move that statement into specific policy changes, practice changes, and procedural changes. And I think when we commit ourselves to learning what that means by listening to people who have been saying it for a very long time, I think we can move a step closer.
I love that unfinished leading notion. That's powerful. Jemelleh, what would you add?
Yeah, so connecting to what Josh's last statement about leadership, a lot of teachers overwhelmingly say that they are concerned about teaching with an anti-racist lens because of the leadership in their building not supporting them. And I hear that over and over and over again. And leadership needs to be loud and clear about their intent and the desire to have teachers lead with an anti-racist lens. I was recently, I taught a class on social justice and equity with some students in Mount Holyoke, and one of them went to a Black Lives Matter protest. And she was reported to her admin for attending the protest. She was called in and she was reprimanded for attending the protest. Those two can't live together. You can't say that we want you to teach in a particular way, but when teachers enact that, they are reprimanded for it. So that is a problem of leadership, and all leadership, building level, district level, they need to step up and be loud and clear about their intent. The next thing as teacher leaders that I think is important for us to do is to band together, assemble your team. Who are the other people who are ready to do this work, and how can you connect with them so that you can stay strong in the work, because it's long work. So you're going to need a team. You need people to support you. You need thought partners. You need to be able to have a community in order to do this work long term and to do it well. So assemble your team. And the other thing so Josh and I talk quite a bit offline just about education in general. And the thing that he always challenges me to do and to think about is how deeply do teachers need to understand and learn their content? And in this moment, that is more important than ever, because not only do you need to know all about math and science and social studies, you need to know how to also infuse an anti-racist lens as you teach that content. What has been really helpful for me over this summer is to continually learn every single day, bit by bit by bit. And one resource that I'd like to share with you is called the Zen Ed Project. And the Zen Ed Project has this thing that they do. It's called This Day in History. And on this day in history, it gives you just some article or some facts about things that happen in history. And for me, that is continual learning. And it has been feeding my energy to move forward in this work, to just learn more. And as I learn more, I want to teach more and I want to teach differently. It's just so energizing. So the other thing that I just encourage teachers to do at this moment is to intentionally learn just a little bit every single day and commit to that so that you can be ready for your students.
Thank you. Let me turn to you, Mary Cathryn. Let me frame the question this way. You know, after Philando Castile was murdered, there were a lot of communities in Minnesota, particularly in the Twin Cities metro area, who said this moment was going to be different. But I don't know that the change really came. And then we had the murder of George Floyd, and we now have again people saying this moment is going to be different. And you now in a state leadership role have an opportunity to make it different. You and the governor, and you weren't there then, but you are now. How are you thinking about this moment, particularly in Minnesota, and how to make it different?
Yeah. I really appreciate that question because I recognize that I have inherited a lot of the activism that was fledgling, perhaps when Philando Castile was murdered, and really sort of built up and coalesced around some really meaningful measures, some building blocks we are actually still working on now. We just finished a legislative session in Minnesota where, for example, a lot of people worked together to win a state law prohibiting the suspension and expulsion of preschool students in the state of Minnesota. And just let that sit for a minute, that it took effort, it took work to win the prohibition of the suspension of 3 and 4-year-olds from their learning, which, suspending a 3 and 4-year-old is like, there's nothing developmentally appropriate about any of that. And it took that effort. And that, some of those seeds were started when we really, when we took a hard look at the school to prison pipeline work. We took a hard look at the ways our schools are still shifting from that control and compliance, that zero tolerance period, that quite frankly, all of us, our schools were swept up in when our societies were really committed to that zero tolerance period. That when, as a new teacher in 1992, when an administrator walked into my classroom, I was evaluated on how well I could control my students and how they would comply with my instructions. And what I realized as a teacher is control and compliance doesn't bring me a lot of joy. And it's actually not part of a really strong teaching and learning condition, right? That if the strongest teaching and learning conditions meet the academic needs of a student and the social emotional needs of students and do so in a safe and welcoming environment, then really I need to actually center my classroom on community, which I am going to, again, means centering it on my students and their families. And I want to go back to something that Mr. Parker said, and that is that I don't want us to overlook the talent and expertise that already resides in our schools and in our communities. If your school has an American Indian Parent Advisory Committee, center their recommendations in your school's work. When I was a local union president and I wanted my teachers union to really contribute to lead the work at diversifying the teaching profession, the first thing I did was interview members of my union who were teachers of color or Indigenous teachers and ask them, how did you get into teaching? Why did you want to teach? And I learned a lot about what our union should be doing to advocate for a sustainable profession, a profession that was welcoming and not hostile to teachers of color or Indigenous teachers. And then also don't overlook the contributions deeply meaningful relationships with families can bring. I really feel like 4 years ago when we had to stop and take a hard look at living in a community that could lose Philando Castile, someone students and colleagues loved dearly, and say, what was around us? How did we contribute to this? And what do we do differently? Recognizing that centering the experiences of students and their families and the experts among us had to be one of the first places to go. And then looking more deeply at some of those structures that create, that perpetuate, I should say, a lot of divisions, a lot of barriers. Linda's point earlier about my responsibility as a white woman to look at a profession I was eager to get into, a profession I still love dearly, but the role that norming the profession of teaching to white women has done over time to keep us from being a fully diverse profession, to keep our students from fully fully connecting with us as educators, that was a point in time where we have these are the building blocks we have to work on, that we are going to continue to work on at a state level. And so it has to be that two-pronged approach. One, if you are an educator listening, start by looking at the voices you can center in your school communities. Don't overlook those voices that are already there, the talent, the expertise around you. And for those of you with me who are policymakers at any level, whether you are a policymaker at the state level, at your teachers union level, at your school board level, in your own professional development committee, perhaps, look at how do you examine the structures we've all inherited and determine that you can rebuild them. Again, if this other pandemic, COVID-19, and completely, turning us into distance learning educators has taught us anything, it's actually that maybe we actually don't need a lot of time to study something before shifting a structure and saying that structure actually didn't work. And it took this for us to realize that we can actually reimagine something and we can actually do it together.
Thank you. I'm mindful that I think that we are nearing the end of our time. So I want to make sure we give everyone a chance to offer a closing reflection. I want to frame it in this. A friend, DeRay McKesson, who is an activist, particularly around issues of police violence, but across a range of issues of racial justice, has this thing that he says, which is very powerful, which is that hope is not magic, hope is work. And I would love for each of you to reflect on what is the work in which you are engaged, in which you see educator colleagues engaged, that is giving you hope in this moment when certainly when we turn on cable news, it can feel a little bit depressing and overwhelming. And so we need to look for those sources of hope. I will say I'm drawing hope from each of you and your vision for what school can and should be for kids, and for the just honest conversation about issues of race and equity that we've been able to have here. But let me ask each of you to share a closing thought. So Jemelleh, I'll start with you.
Thank you, John. So I am drawing hope from lots of areas in social media where I'm seeing teachers come together. And what is giving me so much hope is that they are speaking up for themselves. In education, like teachers are notorious for allowing things to happen to them, rather than being a part of a conversation that they can impact what's happening around them. But I'm seeing that teachers are gathering together and they're speaking up for themselves. As Mary Cathryn was just talking about, like connecting to your school board, they're going to school board meetings. They are talking back to their school board. They are saying what they need. They are saying what their students need. They are saying what their families need. And that makes me so hopeful and excited about what happens next. And I just hope that they continue down that path and not get weary or get nervous about job loss, because I know that that's a reality for many of them. But right now they're in it, and I'm loving it. I'm excited about that. So teachers, keep doing what you're doing. Keep speaking up and speaking out for yourselves and for your students.
Thank you. Mary Cathryn?
Yeah, thank you. It's really been an absolute privilege to be with all of you this morning and this afternoon. So thank you so much. I will say that the collaboration that I am seeing, and that coupled with the way the silos are breaking down, I am seeing it at the state level where, obviously at the Department of Education, we have been working side by side with the Department of Health, as well as higher education and employment and economic development and labor and industry, like figuring it out and looking at students, children and their family units and figuring out what does that holistic support look like? But it's not even just at the state level. I look at the sort of success our full service community schools had in the distance learning model, because families they already had such meaningful relationships with families that when families had a question about their own employment, about healthcare access, about housing, they turned to those full service community schools, and they had relationships in the community to really be able to answer and support families. The same goes for educators, our paraprofessionals, our teachers, our building principals and assisting principals, again, seem to have a collaborative spirit. There is a camaraderie now that we cannot lose, because that sort of camaraderie in a professional collaboration can really make a difference for our students, can really change things, move mountains, rebuild our schools. And so the thing that really gives me hope is that collaboration and that camaraderie I am seeing. It seems at every level. And I absolutely want to keep fanning the flames of that and keep shifting it in the right direction.
Fantastic. Josh?
John, thank you so much. You were an expert moderator. I appreciate the way that you pushed the conversation and managed the conversation. I'm sure you had a lot to say, and I'll be looking forward to continuing following you and listening to what you have to say in this matter. And thank you, Mary Cathryn, and of course, Dr. Coes, who I'm going to jump on another breakout with in a few minutes. So I'm excited to continue. This has really turned up my juices, so I'm ready to go the next breakout. I'll say this. I started teaching now 15 years ago. And after my first year of teaching, I got a sort of conditional needs improvement evaluation. Now, I didn't start in teaching. I was a sports broadcaster by trade, and that's what I went to school for at Towson. And I switched because I thought that was going to be my calling, teaching. And after the first year with my principal, at that time, Tom Schuldeis, who recently passed, he said he sees a lot of potential in me, but that I need a lot of assistance. And I was sort of taken aback by it, but I realized that it was a vote of confidence, but I needed to do something differently. And so I was so frustrated because I wasn't reaching kids that looked like me, but actually came from a different perspective than me. So I went to Barnes & Noble's, and I was just at my wit's end and went to the education section and picked out this book. And this book was called Teaching Reading to Black Adolescent Males by Dr. Alfred Tatum. After I read that book, it completely changed my perspective on what I have to do and what I have the power to do. So what I'm drawing hope from in this time is that I can be that book to other people who are now ready to engage in the work. Like, I can be that bridge. I can share my experiences as an African-American male educator on both sides of the spectrum to people who now want to earnestly engage in this work. This work's going to outlive me. And hopefully when I'm gone, the work that I have done to be the bridge for other people can lead us to a place where there are so many people that look like me that actually have the liberatory education that they deserve. Because liberatory education isn't just for people who look like me. It's for everybody. And so that's what I'm drawing hope from in this time, that I can be that same bridge that I needed 15 years ago today to somebody else.
Thanks so much. Well, I want to end this panel with the same word that Casey used after Reverend Barber, which is to say amen. Thank you all for the opportunity to be in conversation with you all. And thank you all in the NSOI community for the opportunity to spend this time together.
Wow. Well, I'm sure all of us feel the same way. And I want to invite you all, wherever you are, please give this panel a loud round of applause. And we just owe it to you to say thank you. Thank you so very much, Jemelleh. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Mary Cathryn. Thank you, John. Not just for your words today, but for the tremendous work you've put in over your careers to be able to bring this much wisdom, this much experience to this conversation today. Just the breadth of topics and the depth of your wisdom, I think, has gotten us all really filled up right now.